Hello everyone, this is Ina. Today I would like to show you my new journal, which I have called Secret Garden. This journal did not begin with an idea. It began with a feeling and with a few very unique, very special materials that found their way to me by pure chance. First of all, I would like to talk about this piece of leather. This is 18th century leather and it comes from an antique notary's desk. I found it through a man who had spent his entire life restoring antique furniture and who at that time was about to retire. You know, there was something very touching in this encounter, as if this leather was being passed on one last time. I was immediately drawn to this contrast. The dark, aged, almost severe background with gorgeous shabby patina bearing scratches. I do not know, here you can see them, probably of a fountain pen, and the refined and delicate gold motif on the borders, still so glorious, still aristocratic. I can show you a loose scrap for you to see this leather better. Another very special material used is this 19th century French baker's linen. Traditionally, this kind of linen was used by bakers to shape the dough for bread, especially for baguettes, allowing it to rise slowly while preserving its form. I will show you this fabric that I have in a separate piece. Here it is. This linen, marked by time with its rich patina, still carrying traces of flour and ash, is just such an incredible embodiment of warmth and humanity. When I was ironing it, I had an impression that I could still smell warm bread. I have included below the link to the antique textile shop where I found this linen. I checked out their site before preparing this video. It seems that they still have some baker's linen like this, even though a bit younger, vintage rather than antique, but still very, very beautiful. Now, with these gorgeous pieces of leather and linen in my hands, I felt at the same time overwhelmed, humbled, and so inspired. And then, quite unexpectedly, I came across another treasure. A piece of black silk, most likely of the 19th century, perhaps even earlier, with delicate floral embroidery done entirely by hand. I do not know much about its story. I only know that once it was a part of a curtain in an old French chateau. And I can tell you that it is truly breathtaking. Here is another piece that I have. I admit that I have some more of them. It's so fragile. It's so breathtakingly beautiful from both sides. This lavish embroidery became the last and the crucial element for the Secret Garden to emerge. I already knew that this would be quite a special journal, both restrained and rich. For me, a secret garden is something that belongs only to your heart, something that does not need to be explained, a quiet personal space, fragile, intimate, made of moments that are yours alone. In a way, it's just about being human. To create the cover, I wrapped the linen around two bookbinding chipboard panels. In the area of the spine, I backed the fabric with an additional lining. The journal has 5 signatures and 80 pages, both sides counted. In order for the journal to open flat, I have sewn the signatures to a hidden spine made of an antique eco-stained handkerchief reinforced at the back with some Tyvek paper. Here I can show you a remaining scrap of this handkerchief. On the first page of the journal that is made of an antique ledger from 1880s, you can see a vintage photo of a small girl and a cutout of an antique book page with the word Les Jardins, meaning the gardens in French. Here there is a scrap of very delicate antique lace, which is like a promise that the life of this little girl will be happy and full of beauty. On this page, you can see the reverse of the same ledger page and another ledger page dated 1869. I have created a very light collage with pressed cherry blossoms and almost imperceptible faint presence of a young girl's face here, two fragments from similar and yet so different end sheets from antique books or photo albums, this one to the left in soft almond green, and this one to the right adorned with discreet and yet luxurious gold motif. I hope you can see it. I have also added an antique French postage stamp. The pages have been delicately distressed with inks and attached to each other, or rather reinforced with a strip of antique muslin of cotton. Here to the left you can admire the softly worn ledger page, and this page is made of a fragment of vintage sewing paper, still carrying the traces of its past use, the handwritten notes, the delicate sewing marks. I have added a faint circular rust stain, and here I have stitched to the paper a fragment of a very old, very damaged children's collar in handmade lace. Although so fragile, it still holds its original small mother-of-pearl button. This page makes me think of the beginning of a new day, with its rising sun, with all its anguishes and hopes. More delicate rust stains on the tracing paper. And here to the right there is a fragment from an antique photo album page with eco-printed plants. I have put below the link to my detailed tutorial on how to create botanical eco-prints like this. Here I have included a small vintage portrait of a young man. His gaze turned slightly away, as if caught in a moment of thought. His face is so soft, so handsome, that I just wanted to continue that softness by adding this delicate fragment of antique lace. Just beneath the photograph there is a torn fragment of a French phrase, meilleure salutation, meaning best regards in English. Now that this image is visible, I can tell you a little more about this paper. It is a fragment of a 19th century engraving on a richly textured paper. It features a garden bench adorned with delicate floral motifs. I have stained the paper with sepia watercolor ink, which for some unknown reason has taken on an unexpected violet hue, soft, muted, slightly unpredictable. The page on the right is a fragment of antique marbled end paper. I love its fluid pattern. It makes me think of quiet water warmed by gentle sunlight. I do not know how it feels to you, but I find that there is a kind of magic happening between these two pages, and that together they create quite a special atmosphere. This spread is quite raw and organic. I have just glued a few scraps from antique blotting paper here, and this antique notary deed paper has its original stains and patina. I have just slightly folded it and fixed the fold with an old metal clip coming from an antique box. Here you can see somewhere in the text that that the paper comes from 1749. It's really very old. I would also like to draw your attention to this faded and very decorative fiscal stamp embedded within the writing. On the right, there is an image of a woman looking through a window. I printed it on a tissue paper from a vintage photograph, and then I mounted that print on a piece of antique paper that I slightly distressed. And this is actually the front side of that paper with its original delicate floral lace print. And this this page is an eco print of a rose on antique paper. You can see exactly how I created this eco print and many other floral eco prints in my tutorial. I have put the link below the video. On the left, there is a faint and delicate eco print, almost like a ghost image. The page to the right comes from an antique Paris directory. I often use such pages to clean my brayer when working with a jelly plate. And here the surface still carries those traces. The dark background and the soft gray marks are in fact the imprint of that gesture. I then added a few fragments of antique papers to form this simple collage. Here I have distressed the directory page and a page with a botanical print. Across both pages you can see fragments of tissue paper bearing the imprint of lace. In fact, the lace was placed directly onto the printer and copied onto the tissue paper that I had previously attached to a standard copy paper sheet. Another delicate botanical print, this time in a soft, warm pink tone. I have embellished it only with this small fragment of an antique French book bearing a single word, fleur, meaning flower. On the right, a fragment of soft, both in color and to touch, antique blotting paper. Here I have just added an antique fiscal stamp for a small accent. And here you can see another layer of antique blotting paper that I discovered inside one of my old ledgers. This one is like a delicate veil. The marks that you see are original ink stains. I wish you could feel its softness and its fragility. On this spread, I stay within warm sepia tones. On the right page, there is a heavily distressed fragment of a 19th century French chateau directory. And I have added a small vintage photograph in similar faded sepia tones, a landscape that almost dissolves into the page. For some additional texture, I added a fragment of a vintage book binding. Here you can see some more of the French Chateau directory page. And on the right, an antique ledger page onto which I printed a portrait of a very young Victor Hugo. It's quite hidden here. If you are curious, I can show you the original portrait that I used. Here it is. I have covered this page almost entirely with a fragment of antique lace in delicate beige with a subtle pink tint. The needlework is so exceptionally refined that it is difficult to believe that it was made by human hands. Here you can see a subtle collage at the background and an original old vintage portrait of a woman that I have hand-stitched to the page. There is something special about this woman. She is beautiful, she definitely has a strong character, yet I have noticed that she looks quite tense on this photo. I have added this fragment of antique floral lace, which is completely different from the one we just saw on the previous page. This one looks almost childish and naive. Perhaps without fully realizing it, I just wanted to bring in another facet of her, something more tender, more vulnerable. The page to the right is made of an old envelope torn open. Its upper side is covered with a piece of antique cotton muslin that I have folded to echo the torn edge of the envelope. I have further embellished this envelope with a few irregular cross-stitched lines here. You know, when I create my pages, I do it quite intuitively and without thinking. But afterwards, I often find myself looking back and trying to understand what led me there. And here it seems to me that the tension in this woman's posture, together with those repeated cross stitches, it speaks of waiting, of days being counted one after another. And the torn envelope perhaps suggests the impatience of finally reading what it contained. Here we can see the front side of the envelope with the handwritten address and the beautiful green postmark. If I am not wrong, it dates 1946. I have just added a few scraps of antique marbled paper here and here. On the right page, there is a delicate eco print. No, sorry, this is a jelly print of a rose and just one circular rusty stain, almost like the sun lowering towards the horizon in the evening. On the left, as you can see, this page is quite dark, raw and irregular, almost entirely covered with marks from cleaning the jelly plate. There is also a very faint rust trace, barely visible. On the right, there is a botanical image, very refined and detailed. I have added a small fragment of antique black lace over it, and at the bottom, a tiny piece of an antique map. I quite like the contrast between these two pages. This one feels more instinctive, almost accidental, and this one, to me, it represents beauty in its precision, with each tiny detail so controlled in the drawing, in the needlework, and finally even in the map making. Again, this is amazing how I discovered my own pages when preparing the description for you. Here there is another botanical drawing of an iris. I find it very elegant in its simplicity. The page on the right is a fragment of an antique notebook with a handwritten poem or a song. I love this expressive handwriting. Between the two pages, I placed a translucent textile fragment salvaged from an antique communion dress. I aged it slightly with rust, which gave it this soft, warm tone. And I have sewn it in a way that it forms little pockets on both pages. Here you can see a little more of this beautiful handwriting. On the right, This is an end paper from an antique ledger with a very delicate floral pattern, almost like textile in gray-green tones. Somehow it made sense to add a fragment of antique ticking fabric here, in similar tones, but with its simple linear pattern contrasting with the intrinsic floral motif. You can notice two small pieces of adhesive tape here and here. I added and aged this one myself. As regards this one, it was originally present there and I just did not want to remove it. This spread is very raw, very textured. On the left, this is simply the reverse side of the end paper from the previous page. I kept it exactly as I found it, with all the marks, the stains, the lines, without trying to change anything. On the right, this is actually an old ledger page, but you can't really see it anymore. It is entirely covered with mixed media textures. For now, what you can see is just a textured surface. There are some gray, a bit of green, almost mineral tones with darker patches. You can also notice these stitched lines. They come from something attached on the other side, which we will see later, but I like that they remain visible here. They almost create a loose frame within this page. On the left, this is a ledger page dated 1869, as marked at the top. The strong texture from the other side has left its traces here as well, which gives the paper even more character. I added a fragment of antique lace with a rose pattern, and just above it, a worn piece of dark burgundy leather from an antique book cover. On the right, there is a fragment of a 19th century school notebook with mathematical formulas and corrections in this quite vivid fuchsia tone, which somehow resonates to me with the leather scrap here. On the left, there is a small collage with a fragment of printed text, some handwriting, and a few pressed snowdrops that I have stitched to the page. At the bottom, I added a piece of cotton taken from inside an antique quilt. It has such a soft, airy texture that it reminds me a little of melting snow. On the right, there is a blank antique ledger page with some coffee staining. On the left, I attached a piece of antique ticking fabric in a way that it forms a small belly band, so you can slip something behind it if you wish. And on top of it, I stitched an antique photograph of a lady in a garden. The image is very old, quite faded and soft. And on the right, there is an antique paper with an eco print of leaves. At the bottom, I added a fragment of antique wallpaper, which blends very organically into the page. You can hardly distinguish it at first. This minimalist spread is probably one of my favorites in the whole journal. On the left, there are more eco prints, and behind them you can still clearly see the lines of an old blank music sheet. On the right, this is a blank page from an antique ledger. The paper has a very particular texture, thin but still very strong. And if you look carefully, there are also watermarks on it, very discreet but present. I kept this page almost empty and made only a very small collage at the bottom here with a fragment of antique book binding, a piece of antique lace, and the word cependant in French, which could be translated as however or and yet. And there is something I'm noticing just now. There is a presence of lines here and there across the spread. On the music sheet, on the ledger page, even in the middle, on the handkerchief used for the hidden spine, and even in this small bookbinding element, there are also these textured lines as well. It all feels like a very soft, almost imperceptible dialogue between the elements. Here I have decided to leave the blank ledger page almost untouched, with just a small darker fragment discreetly added in the corner. And on this page you can see a darker background. It's craft paper distressed with black gesso and painted tissue paper with its exposed raw torn edge here. All these organic earthy colors at the background, they feel to me like a shift of light, like a passage from day into night. I must admit that this spread is very personal to me. This tiny cherry blossom fragment comes from a chocolate box that I brought back from Ukraine, where I had gone to see my family several months ago. It holds a lot to me. Even its smallness is intimate and meaningful to me. I also placed here a fragment of an antique French book page with the words "ce que j'aime," which means what I love. Probably I just needed to clearly name what matters. And the fuchsia stitches. Bold, vivid, irregular, almost painful. I just leave it to you to interpret what they may carry. This spread is rather quiet. On the left, this is a piece of craft paper that I stained with black gesso. It actually comes from a vintage grocery shop bag from 1940s. I left this page very simple just as it is. On the right, there is another antique ledger page with very light handwriting and a soft coffee stain. At the top, I added a small fragment from an antique diary. The common thing between the two pages is that we can only see the reverse stitches. The fuchsia stitching from the previous page here and the reverse of the stitches here, suggesting that something is stitched on the other side. And honestly, this is something I like. It feels a little like the back of things. Not necessarily beautiful and somehow chaotic, but in a way harmonious. When I look at this spread, when I feel its energy now, I can only tell you that to me, it's all about tenderness. On the left, this is another fragment of an antique ledger page, dated 1912, softly coffee stained. If you look closely, the stain itself almost forms a kind of floral trace, and I added this fragment of antique lace here, which seems to follow the lines of the stain as if it naturally belonged there. Here, on the right side, we have this torn paper with delicate rose background, heavily distressed with black gesso. You can see all those cracks, but they do not break the softness. They almost make it more fragile. And because the page is torn, you can already glimpse what comes next. And this spread, of course, is more intense, more explicit. I have covered the black background with a rose image here with a delicate black veil, with light embroidery, with one of its edges partly covering the faces of the two lovers. In fact, this is a vintage postcard that I have just slightly distressed on the borders. On this spread, you can see the French word humain, human, that I have torn out of a vintage book, and behind there is a delicate collage with another fragment from the old chateau directory, the black lace from the previous page, and the rose photo background. Here there is another fragment of the antique ledger page with its soft, almost floral coffee stains. On the left, this is the reverse side of the same ledger page we just saw before. The coffee stain is still there, still very soft. On the right, there is this beautiful botanical image. I have added to its edge a fragment of antique hemp fabric, very raw and textured. I was very satisfied with this composition without fully understanding why at first. Okay, the combination of colors and textures, that was obvious. But then I noticed an additional detail. Don't you find that the threads on the raw edge of the fabric echo somehow the thorns on the plant's stems? It was purely accidental, but that was a happy accident. On the left, there is another botanical image, very delicate and light. In the lower corner, I added a fragment from an antique box. I do not remember any longer exactly what it contained, perhaps handkerchiefs. I just love this beautiful piece of gold paper together with this very soft pink silk beneath it. In the middle, you can still see the strip from the craft paper stained with black gesso. On the right, this is an antique paper on which I eco-printed plants. And honestly, I still find it hard to believe that I made it myself. It has such an incredible depth to it. And this play of lights and shades, it's magic. Again, if you want to know how exactly I made these eco prints, I have included the link below to the video with my tutorial where I show and explain the whole process step by step. Along the inner edge of the page, there is also this very delicate embroidered trim with a tiny floral motif. It has been rusted, which gave it these warm aged tones and made it blend beautifully into the print. Here you can see another beautiful eco print on the reverse of the same paper we saw just before, and on the right there is this beautiful fragment from an antique magazine with this woman. Her posture is so graceful, so calm. I added a piece of very delicate antique lace here, and in the lower corner there is this small fragment from that black silk embroidery I used inside the cover, the one from an old French chateau. On the left, there is an antique ledger page distressed with some sepia ink stains. You can also see here the black threads with which I stitched the embroidery to the other side of the page. I decided just to leave those knots and threads as they are. On the right, there is an antique book page with a Paris garden view in the same warm sepia tones. I just added a small fragment of a 19th century wallpaper with a rose here. Here you can see the reverse of the same antique book page. And on the right, there is this layered collage. I leave it to you to discover the details. I just would like to mention a few of them. Do you see a small heart here hidden in the handwriting? This is another fragment of the chocolate box that I mentioned before. And there is also a small rusty paper clip. On this side, the clip holds an extract from an antique magazine with this beautiful image. And as you can see, I mounted the collage on the reverse of this beautiful earthy colored marbled paper from an antique book. And here there is another botanical eco print that I made. I made it on very old French book page dating back to the 17th century. Can you imagine that? This is the oldest paper in this journal. More beautiful eco print. Here I have transferred a fragment of this beautiful lady photo on a piece of antique pink blotting paper, and I have added a small embroidery pattern fragment here. On the right, you can see a blank antique ledger page with the reverse, almost ghost eco print of a rose. Here we can see, let's say, the right side of the rose eco print. It stays very subtle and yet intense, with this dark black, still rich Bordeaux color, and this soft, warm brown here, as if sunlight was coming through the image. And on the right, there is this child reaching out towards the rose and that light. This child image comes from an antique book. I have softened its edges, having rubbed some charcoal powder into the background. And one last small detail, this gorgeous tea-stained delicate antique floral lace fragment here. And this is the last spread of the journal. Here you can see a fragment of an original antique child's drawing with pencil from 1920s or a little bit earlier. Very simple and honest. And on the right, another fragment of that lavish, that absolutely gorgeous and exquisite 19th century embroidery that I already used in the beginning of the journal and later on. I placed them together quite intuitively, and now I feel I understand why. Perhaps I was trying to express this inner garden we carry, how it begins in uncertainty, and how, if we allow it, it can grow into something more daring, more beautiful than we might have imagined. And something else quite symbolic that I have noticed, that's the fragility of these embroidered flowers. You can see it in particular here. Well, beauty is fragile, we know that, but it is there and it is precious. On that, I wish you a lot of beautiful and happy moments, and I thank you for watching this video. I hope it has brought you some joy and some inspiration. Take care and goodbye.